Hi, everyone. Thank you all for coming. We'll be working on academic standard time, so we will definitely wait for people to trickle in.
We're going to give it just another 1 to 2 minutes.
Shahana, you can go ahead and share the screen for the, is that okay? Actually, well, let's wait actually maybe until Nicole's chance to introduce us. I guess that's probably good.
I think that we'll go ahead and get started since we're a little bit past the hour, just to be respectful of everyone's time. Hello and welcome to Peer Review 101. This is a workshop hosted by Black and Neuro and Reviewer Zero. On behalf of the Black and Neuro community, thank you to Reviewer Zero for providing this critical information to all of us, to the community at large. I hope today gives you some tools on how to respond to manuscript reviews and provide manuscript feedback. And with that, I'm going to hand things over to our workshop moderators. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Nicole, and thanks so much to Black and Neuro for putting this event together. We're really excited to be here. I'm Matt Goldrick. I am at Northwestern University. I'm a cognitive scientist and a linguist, and I'll pass things over to Miriam just so she can introduce herself.
Hi, I'm Miriam. I'm a cognitive neuroscientist at Columbia.
And with us as well is Shahana Ansari, who is part of the Reviewer Zero team. We're super happy that she's here with us too.
Thanks, everyone.
Shahana, you can go ahead and start. Thanks. Can you go ahead and share the slides? Okay. So there's a QR code here, which is for the pre-survey that we are really trying to improve these workshops. Hopefully you had a chance to fill this out. We included it in the registration, but if you haven't, you could take a quick look at this if you have a moment. So today we want to talk about the process of peer review, and we want to try and open up that black box and help you understand sort of how the sausage is made, what happens behind the scenes, and then how you can most effectively participate in that system. To start off, I want to acknowledge that Miriam, Shahana, and I are just part of a much larger team of graduate students, postdoctoral fellows, and faculty that are interested in reimagining peer review in order to grow a diverse new generation of scholars in psychology and neuroscience. And the work you're going to see today is really a product of this collective and what we've all done together. It's good to start off with just considering, why do we actually need to do this session? Why is it that peer review is so mysterious, and why is it that people have so many different negative emotions, I think, surrounding it? And I think it comes from this contrast between two things. First off, peer review is really central to science as we currently practice it. It's how we improve what we do. It's how we sharpen our work. But at the same time, while it's so central to science, it's actually really difficult to navigate. And I'll talk through a little bit of why it's so difficult to navigate. So the other central issue here is that because peer review is so central to how we do our science, it really determines who can advance in science. So you have to successfully navigate peer review in order to get more senior positions, in order to get promoted more generally, and to succeed. But the other thing it does, which is actually often not talked about so much, is that peer review matters for who wants to advance in science. Peer review does a lot of establishing who is in the field and who is out of the field. What are the questions that are part of the field and what are the questions that are not part of the field? And that is another factor. I think it really helps shape why it's such a loaded process for people to go through. So part of what happens with peer review is that the process is actually pretty confusing and it's not explicitly taught. And that's a big part of what we want to do today. It's part of the hidden curriculum that we want to make more visible. And if you feel like, I have no idea how peer review works and I'm totally alone, you are not totally alone. Almost every single person who comes into graduate school has no idea what peer review is. And if you're an undergraduate student, it's even more likely you don't know what peer review is. Here's a tweet from Wendy Christensen talking about how when she started graduate school, she thought that it meant the paper was reviewed by other graduate students. And then people are so embarrassed because the first rule of peer review is that you don't talk about peer review. And so it's hard for people to figure this out. They have to covertly do so. Another part of what makes peer review such a difficult process for people is that it includes rejection and critique of work. And that's actually really important. So the way that we improve things in many different domains involves critique. So think about if you ever played a sport, how did you learn to play that sport? You didn't just go out there and do your thing. Probably people were coaching you and helping you figure out, oh, you're doing this not quite right, try doing things a different way. Or just think about any other sort of academic discipline you've been involved in. If you're taking courses, part of that involves sort of critique and grading of your work. The problem is often that critique is incredibly harsh. So here's a nice post here about contrasting when your mom talks to you about your scientific research and is like Barney, but when other scientists do it, it's like being attacked by a monster. This person here describes it as, I liken it to trying to run across a field of zombies, each one trying to eat you. The other thing that makes, so peer review is this really loaded process. It's extremely important. It involves all this negativity. The other thing that is really critical to know about peer review is that success in that domain is really different from success as a student. So, sorry. Success as a student versus success in peer review can be contrasted along a couple different dimensions. So when you succeed as a student, what you try and do is earn excellent grades. That's how you get promoted. That's how you move forward. In peer review, success is never getting a good grade. No paper is ever perfect. And rejection of papers is actually the norm. What we do is sort of refine it over multiple types of rejections and encouragement of revision. That relates to this other thing with, as when you're a student, you take classes, you turn in the assignment and it's just done. You walk away and there's nothing more to do. In peer review, you're doing many, many, many rounds of revision. Success as a student also involves independence and solo work. But as you probably realize, in science, what we wind up doing is a lot of collaborative work and interdependence. And that extends not just to your collaborators on your paper, but you are also interdependent on the opinions of the reviewers and opinions of editors. And then finally, students' work involves explicit assignments, guidelines, and instruction, whereas peer review is typically learn as you go, and no one tells you the rules of peer review in advance. That's something we want to work on today and talk a little bit more about. So here's the plan for today. We'll have three parts. First, we'll talk a bit more about what is peer review and how does it work, how the sausage is made. Part two, we'll go through a case study to help you give you a sense of how, when you get reviews, how you should respond to them, how you can sort of structure that response. And then we'll end with a reflection and wrap up. One mechanism we want to use for questions is we have an open Google Doc, which if you just grab this QR code here on the right-hand side of your screen, or type in this tiny URL, it'll probably be easier to use the QR code, you can access a Google Doc where you can anonymously ask questions. You're also feel free to put stuff into the chat. We're really excited to get your questions. I know that can be kind of a little bit intense sometimes, putting yourself out there, so feel free to do it anonymously, and we'll respond to that as well. Okay. All right, let's dive into what is peer review and how does it work. What are the processes and mechanics? Who are the different actors in peer review? What is the broader culture and context? Oh, thanks so much for putting that. Would have been a good idea for us to put that in the chat. Thank you so much for doing that. Okay. So let's talk about the process. And there's probably parts of it that you're really familiar with from the perspective of the author, which we'll show in purple here. So the author writes the paper. They submit that paper to a journal. And then at some point, the author receives a decision. You probably know about all of these parts of peer review. Let's talk about what intervenes between this step, submitting to a journal, and the author receiving a decision. So when you submit a paper to a journal, it goes to an editor. An editor is just a scientist, like me or Miriam. It is just a person who is involved in supervising the journal. Typically, these positions are uncompensated positions, so people are actually doing them in the context of their regular scientific work as well. The editor will take a look at the paper, and they will read through it. And if they think it's not appropriate for the journal or it has very serious problems, they can do what's called a desk reject. And that will be an immediate decision that you'll get. If you submit to a journal like Science or Nature, you'll get that in less than 48 hours typically. So the editors there will look at it and be like, this could be a fine paper, but it's not good for our journal. The other possibility is that the editor decides to send it out for review. If they decide to do that, first they have to select some reviewers. And who are reviewers? They're your peers. They could be other graduate students, they could be faculty, they could be independent researchers. The editor is going to actually maybe have some trouble finding reviewers. This can often be a problem. And so it'll take some time to select the right people. It's also important to know that editors are humans, which I'm sure you understand. But if you think through that, how do you come up with people to look at something? The first place people go is people they know. So often editors are picking people that are like them, which can introduce bias into the system. Once the reviewers have been selected, you've managed to find people that'll look at it, the reviewers provide evaluations. This can take quite some time. So sometimes people follow deadlines. I know you'll be shocked to learn that there are academics who do not follow deadlines. And so sometimes this process can take quite a bit of time. So each reviewer is writing a report basically on the paper they've been asked to review. The editor then reviews these different reports and writes a decision letter. And we'll go through what that decision letter looks like. And the decision letters can take a couple of different forms. One is a reject. This paper is not suitable for the journal. This paper has some really serious issues. You need to go back to the drawing board and start over with it. The one you're really looking for is this middle one, revise and resubmit. Typically, you send a paper and it will come back, and the decision letter will be something like, we are rejecting this version of the paper, but we invite you to resubmit a new version of the paper. And remember, papers are all about this, lots of different rounds of revisions. And so this is a very general part of the process. It's not often you'll get the best decision you might want, which is accept. That is, paper looks great, we're happy to take it. I know of the hundreds of manuscripts that I've dealt with, I know of just one that was accepted on the first round. It's extremely unlikely that that will happen. But I know of lots of ones that are revised and resubmitted, and then that revision is accepted. Now, once the author receives the decision, and we'll look at a decision letter in the next section, the author has a couple of options of what to do. One is to revise the paper and respond to reviews. And so that's what you change the paper in response to the reviews. And then you also write up a document where you respond to what the editor's decision letter contains. You might also decide that it's better to just submit this to a different journal. Sometimes you get reviews back and you realize, wow, this community is not the right community for me. They're asking questions that are really just not relevant. I'm not going to try and please these people who are clearly not interested. I'll just move on to a different journal. And typically when you do that, you might make some sort of small changes to the manuscript. You wouldn't completely rewrite it. The other option, and it's always important to remember that this is a possibility for you, is to just move on with your life. You can say, look, this paper needs a lot of work. I don't have the time to work on it. I really need to do a lot of other things. I'm going to set this aside for now and maybe come back to it at a later point. And that's happened to me. I was working on papers from graduate school 8 years out. So coming back to them and with fresh eyes and being able to work with them. And then all this starts over again. You write a paper, if you've moved on with your life, you write another paper, or if you revise the paper, you work on it, and then you go back through this entire process again. So hopefully that gives you a sense of just the overall architecture of peer review. Are there any questions about any of this? I know it's a kind of complicated flow chart. Okay, we can return to questions you might have later. What we're going to be focusing on is this part. The editor writes a decision, and then how do you deal with that? And here, we just want to emphasize again that, and I found this with my own graduate students. I feel like no matter how many times you hear it, the first time you see this decision and it says reject or revise and resubmit, it feels crushing to people because you're wanting it to be accepted. But that's actually the most common type of thing. Miriam.
I can let you finish your thought if you want, and then there's a few questions in the Google Doc that I can share with you.
Oh, okay, no, that was all I wanted to say here.
Okay, cool. So someone is wondering if you could address some of the reasons that somebody might get desk rejected.
The most common things I've seen, so I've been an editor at Psychological Science, which is a very high throughput journal. So there's lots and lots of submissions coming in and not enough pages to accept all of them. So often there, what we would do is try and figure out, is this a paper that would speak to a really broad audience? Is this something that would make a lot of sense for many different subdisciplines of psychology? And if the answer was no, it would get desk rejected. At more specialized journals I've been at, the desk rejection rate is almost zero. And it's really for papers that are just really off topic, like they're not, it's a journal that's on the cognitive processes involved in language, and someone is writing about social structures and their influence on some sort of, there's no cognitive connection at all. Then it's just not appropriate for the journal. Sometimes people get confused about what they should submit to. So that's my experience with desk rejection. I don't know, Miriam, if you have any other sort of scenarios that you've encountered.
Sometimes the desk rejection is a little opaque. So you get something that says,
Yes.
like, we've assessed your paper and there's not sufficient conceptual advance. I've gotten that 2 times in the last month, but then they don't give any details about what they think is a sufficient conceptual advance. So sometimes it seems like a kind of a form letter that you get that doesn't really give reason beyond they just didn't like feel it, So don't take it too personally if it happens. If it's kind of vague of a statement, a lot of these assessments are inherently subjective and they're not value judgments on your work. It's what the editor feels like is a good fit or not. And so we just don't take it personally and just kind of move on.
Yeah. Thanks. Yeah, that totally fits with me. Yep.
There's also a question about, say you have a project where there's a lot of papers that are using the same data set, which is really common. Now, what happens if a lot of people submit to the same journal using the same data set? Is that a potential reason for the journal to desk reject or not so much?
That's a good question, Miriam. I feel like you'd be better qualified to answer this in this neuroscience context.
Sure. Yeah, I don't have the experience of simultaneously submitting papers using the same data set to the same journal, but I don't think that alone would be enough for a desk rejection, because I think in neuroscience, it's especially in my field, it's very common for people to use the same data set to ask different questions. And so my hunch is that wouldn't be a reason for a desk rejection, but they might have some kind of reason about the novelty or conceptual advance if they feel like, you know, if the different questions being asked by the different papers are not sufficiently different or sufficiently novel to their eyes, that could potentially be a reason. But I think I don't think using the same data set by itself would necessarily lead to a desk rejection. And I have another question for you, Matt. So
yeah,
how do events like COVID, which caused a lot of labs to close, how would that potentially impact the review process, or how did COVID generally affect the review process?
So the impact of COVID on the review process has been diverse, I would say. So one thing has been that the rate at which people are accepting reviews has gone down quite a bit since COVID. And I think my own intuition about that is that it's part of a broader rebalancing of work and life that many people came to in COVID. Like, they were realizing what's most important to them. And so they were like, I don't want to spend time on this type of thing. The other thing is that you can imagine, if there's, just given the stress of COVID, it was so hard to sort of focus on things. And this is often not a very fun part of the process for people, which is something we're hoping to change by changing the culture of review, which we'll talk a little bit more about. And so that's one thing. I think the other thing was that there was initially kind of a pause in papers, and then there was actually quite a large surge of papers that started to come out because people were stuck at home and had lots of time on their hands if they weren't caring for folks. And so that was actually creating just more stress on the system as well. So I think those are the two major impacts that I've noticed and I'm aware of. I don't know if there's anything else to add to that, Marion, but I think that's
yeah. So I'm going to return to the point about the review delays in a second, but I also just want to add for people who work in lab environments where you have to do the work in person, then there was huge delays because you had to shut down the lab, which means you couldn't collect data. And the kind of time that it takes to recover from that is substantially longer than the length of the shutdown. So people say like, oh, you shut your lab down for a month, that means you're a month behind, but actually no, because sometimes you have to restart experiments from scratch. And so you're doing over a lot of work that is way more than a month of delay. And that's something that I don't think necessarily people are really good at factoring in, the extent of delay from COVID. But going back to the review process delays, I do think it's been very, very noticeable that it's harder to get reviewers. It's partly, I think, because people have limited time and they didn't feel like they were being supported by institutions during COVID, and partly because our system doesn't really reward peer review. And so it's one of the first things to go when you're pressed for time. I think it's also worth mentioning that there's work that I posted in the chat showing that this impact of review delay has disproportionate effects on different groups. So people who are white tend to go through the review process faster than people who are people of color. And so that's really problematic because we are judged based on our output for getting into a postdoc position, for being able to graduate, for getting faculty positions, for hiring, tenure, and promotion. And so this is something that's completely not beyond your control. And so if you're a person of color and you're facing review delays that are larger than a white person, and you're getting judged as if you should have output at the same rate, then that's a problem. And so this is one of many places where these sometimes subtle, sometimes not so subtle biases can affect career progression. And it's something that's unfortunately not within your control as an individual author, but something that we can work together to raise more awareness of, so that when you see someone being judged for not having as many papers as person X, if you're in a position of power, you can flag the fact that maybe they had to spend a lot more time under review than their privileged white counterpart.
I pulled up the question doc here. I can see here too. Let me, while you're typing out that one question, you can submit a list of preferred reviewers, and specify people that you shouldn't review. What I would say is that with respect to the latter, you need to be really careful about that. I think I would only put people on there where there's like a very clear identifiable conflict of some kind, and not and not just doing that because oh, this person is kind of maybe doesn't really like my work that much. That can be difficult often with, I think it depends on the editor as to whether they'll respect those decisions. They don't have to. And so that's kind of one where it's like, why bring it up if it's really not going to be that huge of an issue. In terms of preferred reviewers, remember I was talking about how hard it is to find reviewers. As an editor, you are so excited when you have suggestions, and when they're not 2, they're 6, it's great. You're like, okay, I can finally find some people that are good for this. And so it goes along with many things of like, if you can make their lives easier, that's going to make the process move more quickly, of course, right? So they'll have more time to find those reviewers.
Yeah, when you're suggesting reviewers, it's good to keep in mind conflicts of interest. So one thing that's usually considered a conflict is if you've published with the person in the last 5 years. So even if it was a paper where maybe you were not directly mentored by them, but you were both co-authors on the same paper, that's considered a conflict. And so when you're thinking about potential reviewers, you want to make sure that all the authors on the paper do not have conflicts with the suggested reviewer. So haven't published with them recently, did not mentor them, or were not mentored by them in an official capacity like PhD advisor, postdoc advisor, aren't at the same institution. All of those things are considered conflicts.
Yeah. Super surprised by the bias. Yeah. Are these reviews usually blind? That is an option at many journals. So, and many journals are exploring and experimenting with having blinded reviews. The challenge there is most of our fields are small enough that, or many of our fields are small enough that you can probably identify people based on other cues. So there's a question about how effective blinding is, but I think it's not about it. You can look for journals that have that. And it's, as I said, I think more and more journals are experimenting with that.
Yeah, maybe I'll just, sorry if I'm jumping in too much. I always have things to say, but so just to clarify that the blinding here means that the reviewers would be blind to the identity of the authors. And Matt's saying like, usually you can figure out who the authors are because you cite yourself and you build on your own work. So usually you can tell.
Yes.
I'll also say that there are known biases based on topic. And so there's documented biases in the NIH review process where topics regarding around, for example, racial disparities in health due to racist practices, those kinds of topics are devalued by reviewers. And the people that are most likely to be studying those topics are people from communities that are typically marginalized. And so sometimes even if you don't know who the author is, the topic itself is in a group that is more likely to be studied by people from marginalized communities, and the topic is also devalued. And so that could potentially lead to some of these disparities as well.
I'm going to share a link in the chat for a paper that we have recently written and when I say we, I think I should say Miriam did a lot of the work on this. That might be helpful if you're interested in learning more about the what the literature says about these types of biases and how we think we can help change that. Okay, question 7 here. In terms of finding reviewers, is there a list editors choose from? Or can they reach out to anyone in the field? There is a list, typically. If you've ever interacted with a manuscript submission system, you know that many of them are actually pretty clunky and not well designed. And so this is a problem. It's often hard to search these databases. And so often people don't wind up using them. And then they can really reach out to anyone in the field. It's totally up to the editor who they reach out to. And this, as I mentioned earlier, can be a case where you wind up exploring the same networks that you're usually associated with. And the last question, the answer, do you believe there's any bias in the reviewer population concerning factors such as race, gender, age, career stage, or affiliation? Yes, the answer is yes, there, I think I would say. So the people who tend to be reviewers are people that have tended to succeed in the publication process more generally. I think that's sort of where people go to. And there's a lot of biases that influence that, who is in that space. And as if you take a look at the paper, there's a lot more detail on that.
Yeah, unfortunately, yeah, there's bias everywhere. And so reviewers and editors are more likely to be white. And there's homophily biases, meaning that if you share an identity with the author and you're a reviewer, you're more likely to have the author's paper accepted than if you don't share an identity, meaning that if the reviewer is white and the author is white, they're more likely to have their paper accepted than if the reviewer was white and the author was a person of color. So it's a homophily bias generally, similar identity, more likelihood of success. And that's not only reviewer author homophily, it's also editor reviewer author homophily. So editors are more likely to choose reviewers that also have similar identities. And so, yeah, like Matt said, there's a lot of these biases that we've covered that if we're trying to raise awareness of, so that people, especially people in positions of power like editors, could try to counteract them.
So given all of this, how do you keep from being discouraged? And that is a really good question. So this part of what we want to do here is give you more information on how peer review works and how to approach the processes involved in this. And we'll also talk about what do you do when you encounter problematic reviews, when you encounter instances of overt bias. And then the other thing I can say is that I do feel like there is an interest in people in many positions of power in changing. We're working with a lot of editorial boards that come to us wanting to improve their processes, want to reduce these biases. And so we're at a time where I think there's a movement to try and work against these. And so that is, so I think there's hope that things are going to improve. And you're not alone in this process. If you're encountering biases, if you're encountering issues, there are many people who want to try and help. And so I hope that helps it become a little less discouraging. And I don't know, Miriam, if you have other words of wisdom to share about how to not be discouraged in this context.
Yeah, I'm like kind of a pessimistic person. So, but I'll try to keep my pessimism to myself for a while because it is pretty easy to get discouraged by the state of things. And it's easy to kind of say, well, like one of my pet peeves is when people say like, your generation will change it. And then to the next generation, they say, oh, your generation will change it. And I think we need to change it now. And I think there are people who are in positions of power who don't realize the power they have. And they say, like, who am I to be able to change how reviewers act? And it's like, well, you're a reviewer too. You know, and I've heard this from people who are, you know, tenured full professors at institutions where they have a lot of power and they pretend they don't have any. And I think you can't just keep saying, oh, things are changing, the next generations are getting better and better, because I think that we, like Matt and I, and faculty generally, are in places where we could already work to make changes. And that's something that we're trying to do at Reviewer Zero by working with editors and reviewers to make them aware of the power that they have. I also pasted in the chat another paper we recently wrote to highlight how faculty and anybody in a mentorship role can work to improve the culture of peer review.
And Mubarak, you asked, during the submission process, the journals often asked to provide the names of potential reviewers. Are the names submitted involved in the review process? Yes. So the editors are not bound by what you suggest, but given how hard it is to find reviewers, they will almost certainly draw on your suggestions. They won't ask every single person, but they will almost certainly go for some of them. Would be my... Okay, these are really great. Thank you so much for asking these questions. Like, this is, we want to know what you want to know. And so we're really glad that you're offering up these questions here. Let's move forward, and then, but if you want to stop at any time and talk, just let us know. I think the last thing I just wanted to show is yet another This is from a blog post, is that, the goal of a first round submission is not an accept, but a revise and resubmit. That is your goal. Your goal is not to get an A the first time you hand in the paper. It's to get there is promise here, but you need to do more work. That is almost always the outcome, if you're the positive outcome you're looking for. So I'm going to hand it over to Miriam now, who's going to walk through a case study of looking at a decision letter and how we can respond to it.
Yeah, so this is meant to be a highly interactive discussion-based section where we're going to read a sample decision letter that you might get from an editor and sample reviewer comments. So this is from one of my papers. It's been edited for mostly just to make it more concise. But what we're going to do is we're going to ask you to go to this website. So I'm going to put the link in the chat because that was a really good idea. And you can scan a QR code if you're on your phone, but the link is there. So head over to that Google Doc. And we first want you to read the summary of the paper, which is just to help you get situated with respect to the concepts that are going to come up in the decision letter and reviews. So read the summary and then read the decision letter. And then we're going to ask you some questions and have some discussion about it. So I'll just give you a couple minutes to have a read through. All right, so I'm going to slowly transition us back. If you're still reading, that's okay. We'll have time to return to some parts of the letter. But I first want to get people's general first impression. So do you think this is good news or bad news? So you can type in the chat, you can type in the Google Doc, you could raise your hand to chime in, whatever you think, however you want to respond. Just generally, if you got this decision letter, do you think this is good or bad? Some people think it's good news, right? Yeah, keep it coming. What do you think? Seems like it's good. Not bad. Yep. If it's not accepted right away, then it's not bad. Yeah. Yep. Good. Good. Yep. No rerun experiments. Yep. Yep. Great. Yeah. So I think we generally agree that this is good news. So like Matt said, most of the time, the outcome that you want is not just straight out rejection. So if there's an opportunity for resubmission, that is good news. So that's success. And it's especially good news, like if you pointed out, if they're saying you do not have to do new experiments. So that means that the revisions are doable with the data that you have, and you have a way of moving forward. So based on the letter, do you think that the editor was generally supportive or not supportive? And again, you could type in the chat or the Google Doc, however you want to respond. Is your assessment from the letter that the editor is pretty supportive or not supportive? Yep. Great, yeah. So generally the editor is supportive. They're leaving the window for revision, and they do have reservations, but they seem to be reservations that they think you can address. So there's enthusiasm for the value of the work. That's good. So it means that the journal and the reviewers thought that the work was important, that it's valuable for the field. They thought the study was well motivated and the findings are robust. So there's all good news. However, there are issues that have to be addressed. So some reservations, not an outright accept, but still generally good news. So moving to more kind of technical format things, what have you noticed about the parts of the decision letter? So how is it structured, and how is it structured in a way to help the author figure out what to do? And here you could either type in the chat or you could raise your hand if you want to chime in with your sense of the structure, or you could type it in the Google Doc. All right, I can just chime in and answer the question. It's a little bit difficult, but yeah, there's structure. So some of the structure that you might see are, for example, that there is a kind of summary by the editor. So decision letters are usually accompanied by a section at the top that summarizes generally what the reviewer's assessment was. I think this is a marker of an editor who has done a good job. So an editor that's done a good job is one that reads all of the reviewer comments and synthesizes them for the authors. So this is what the reviewers liked, this is what they didn't like, and this is generally what their critiques were. So the editor here did a really good job of saying, these were the good things, these were the things that had some concerns, and here are the 3 critical things that the reviewers agreed on that you have to do. So this is an excellent editor. You might get some editors that do a little bit less of the work. So sometimes, not infrequently, we get a form letter that says, your reviews are below, respond. That's not particularly helpful, but it's pretty common that you might see something like that, where the editor just forwards a template that says, my decision is revise and resubmit. Here's the instructions on how to revise, and here are the reviews. So in that case, the editor doesn't give you a lot of input on how they think you should respond or the key components. But the editor that you see in this decision letter did a really good job of saying, here are the good things, here are the bad things, and here are the critical things that you have to address. So the question is, how is supportive different from good in this case? So it seems like the editor is in support of the paper and summarizes the reviewer comments. Having some reservations doesn't mean they're not supportive. So I think the difference between supportive and the good, bad news is I guess the sense that you get from the editor that they think that you can address the criticisms. So I've had cases where the decision was revise and resubmit, but the editor says something like, I have huge reservations about whether you can actually address these criticisms. And it's very possible that when you submit again, I might reject. We've had that said like pretty much outright. So in this case, I think the news is good because it was revise and resubmit. And the editor seems to convey that they think that there's a lot of promise so that you can address these issues, as opposed to an editor that says revise and resubmit, but I don't think you can do it. Matt, do you want to add to that?
I wanted to add another option, which is that you will receive rejections, just that is going to happen. And sometimes they can be supportive rejections. They can say, this is a really important question. Like there's something really positive about the work, but there's also some fatal flaw at the same time. But the supportive aspect there is that they actually tell you, here is the good part, here are ways you can move forward. And I think that's so you can get supportive reviews that are nonetheless negative reviews.
Great. All right, so I got these reviews and I was pretty ecstatic. So this is an example of something where like you still have work to do. It's not a rejection and there's a way forward. And the editor was awesome, and the reviews and the points they made seemed constructive. So it's not that they were asking us to do things like run new experiments that didn't seem necessary. They had points that we felt were addressable. So what we're going to do now is talk about how to organize your response. So say you're me and you get this decision letter. How would you respond to the different comments that you get from the reviewers? And this is related to a question that we got in the Google Doc earlier, in which somebody asked, like, how do you respond if somebody's asking you to do a bunch of new experiments and you don't think they're necessary or valuable? So what do you do in that case? So we think that there are 3 general ways that you can organize your response to reviewers. There's 3 general classes of response. One of them is you just do it. So this happens in cases where the reviewer is asking you to do something that is important. You recognize that it's important and it is feasible for you to do. So in those cases, it's usually best to just do what they're asking you to do. As long as, it doesn't hurt the paper, it's feasible, you can do it, and you see the value of doing it. The second class of response is to think carefully. So this might be cases where the reviewer highlights something that may or may not be a problem, something that maybe you haven't considered before, something that you're not sure if you can address with new analyses or if you can reason your way out of it. So this requires you to kind of step back for a second, really make sure you understand their criticism, and think about what your data or your experimental design allows you in terms of crafting a response that tells them, here's how I thought through this very carefully and why I do not think it's a concern. And the last one is the pushback. And this is what you might do in cases where they say that you need to do new experiments that you think are beyond the scope of the paper and are not necessary or not feasible. And so you always have the option of pushing back. You don't have to do every single thing the reviewers ask. You don't want to push back on every single response, but usually our rule is that if we do most of the things a reviewer wants, if there's a couple that we push back on, that's fine. And if you're worried about that, what we've done sometimes is consult with the editor in advance and say, the reviewer made this comment. We don't think this new experiment is necessary or feasible. Is this something that you see as essential for a successful revision, or is this something that you think of as optional? And in every case that we've had where we did this, the editor has said, I don't see this as essential. And so then you can feel a little bit more comfortable pushing back. But to make this all a little bit more concrete, we're going to look through some examples. So again, these are paraphrased, condensed versions of comments that I got on this particular paper. So I'm going to read the comment to you, and I'm going to tell you how we responded, and then we're going to poll you to see if you think our response was a just do it response, a think carefully response, or a pushback response. So the reviewer said, yeah, you're interested in identifying preparatory attentional states, meaning that we were interested in finding neural signatures of an attentional state before the person had to engage in it. But the reviewer is saying that there's no long periods of the task in which visual stimulation is absent, and these periods are important for deriving anticipatory neural states. So they're saying we made a key claim, but they don't think our task allowed us to derive a clear neural signature for that claim. And our response was, well, to ensure a clean representation of anticipation, we did these things. So we only compared activity patterns for one period of the task with independent runs of the task. So there's no spurious neural correlations between these conditions because we compared independent runs of the task that were many minutes apart. And the second thing we said is We analyzed only the beginning of the preparation period, removing the part that is most likely to be contaminated by the adjacent task. So the technical specifics are not really important, but based on the tone of the response, do you think this is a response in which we just did what they were asking? Do you think we thought carefully, or do you think we pushed back? And you can just type in the chat or the Google Doc if you think this is a just do it, think carefully, or push back response. Yeah, so as some of you are noting, the boundaries between these three options are not super clear. And so in this case, I think it's both a mixture of think carefully and push back. So we paused, we thought about what in our task allows us to identify these neural signatures, and then we pushed back and saying, no, actually, we did do what we thought we did. And in this case, it was a response that was successful. So this is an example of a successful pushback response. All right, let's do another one. So the focus is on the hippocampus and the ventromedial prefrontal cortex. It's well motivated and sensible, but is there a risk that the authors miss where the real action is? So it would be good to provide a supplementary exploratory analysis to reassure readers. And so our response was, thank you for the suggestion, which we implemented. So we conducted a whole brain searchlight analysis to find regions that showed greater preparatory coding across these conditions. And actually, we found nothing. So given this response, do you think it was a just do it, a think carefully, or a push? Yeah, just do it. So in this case, it's pretty clear. They asked us to do it, and we're like, okay. So this was a case where the analysis was a little bit of a pain. It took a long time for us to do, but it didn't require collecting new data. And we thought, why not look at the rest of the brain? So this was a case where it didn't hurt the paper. It was feasible. It took time, but it was not out of the realm of things that are considered reasonable to do. And it ultimately could have been useful for the paper. And so we just did it. All right. And then last one. The attention manipulation was unorthodox. So prior studies tended to manipulate memory-guided attention in this particular way, but you did it in this other way. So the manipulation that you used was unorthodox, and you should consider how the particularities of your experimental design could have affected your findings compared to other studies. And we answered, we conducted an additional analysis to make sure that the particularities of our design did not affect our ability to link to prior literature. We found these behavioral effects that are consistent with other studies. So people were faster and more accurate when the attentional cue was valid. And this shows that even though our manipulation was unorthodox, we can still compare it to prior work. And we talk about this in the manuscript. So what's your sense from here? Is this a just do it, a think carefully, or a pushback? Yep, think carefully. Great, yeah. So I think you were all really great at identifying the three categories of responses. Do you have questions about when it's appropriate to push back, think carefully, or just do it? Are there other classes of responses that you find yourself engaging in? Or do you just have any comments or questions about how to respond to reviewer comments? I'll give you a little bit of time to type in the chat if you want, and then we'll move on to the next section. All right, so I'm not seeing any typing activity, but if things change and questions pop in your mind, let me know. Oh, okay, so here's something. Are there scenarios where even if you don't agree, you just do it? So I'm thinking in scenarios where maybe the PI is more junior and applying to big journals. There's definitely those cases where we feel like, I like to talk about the difference between something that's essential and something that's a preference, because I think a lot of reviewers are not good at telling the difference. So I think a lot of reviewers feel like, oh, it would be so great if you did this analysis, or I'm really curious in the results of this analysis. And I see those as preferences, not essential. And I think the review process would be a lot better and faster for all of us if people differentiated between preferences and essential revisions. So there are a lot of cases in which you get reviewer comments that are preferences, but if you appease this reviewer, you can get into this journal. And as much as I and a lot of you probably hate it, people judge you based on the journals that you publish in. And so if you're at a career stage where you're a junior, or maybe you really want to help your student or your postdoc get a big paper, there are probably circumstances in which you're like, you know, I don't think this is valuable, but if this is the thing that's going to help us get into that journal, then we just do it. So I think as long as it doesn't hurt the paper and it's feasible, then it's something that you should probably do. If it's going to take you 2 years, it's not really useful and there's just not money to do it, that's probably a case where you might want to push back and consult with the editor. But there are certainly a lot of times when you just do it, even though you don't really see the value. Yeah, good question. All right, so the review example that I gave you was really good. So I gave you one of the ones that I just thought honestly was lovely. You know, the editor was great, the reviewers were supportive, they had stuff for us to do, but it was all reasonable. And we knew how to respond, and our responses were accepted, and it was just one round and it was done. So that was great. That's ideally how it works. But that's not always how it works, because sometimes you get reviewers who say things that range from nasty to racist, biased, derogatory, and harmful. And it's not unusual. So there's been a survey that we referenced in our paper that shows that over half of respondents who ranged from master's students to full professor, over half of those people said that they received an unprofessional peer review. And the reason that this is, first of all, bad and problematic on its own, but something that makes it worse is that members of groups that are typically underrepresented or marginalized reported having a disproportionately negative impact of those unprofessional reviews, which makes sense. So if you're in a community where you're constantly told you don't belong or constantly get messages that you are not good enough, and then you get this review that is unprofessional and biased, it has a worse effect on you than someone who's from a privileged group who's constantly getting messages that they're brilliant and they belong. And so these problematic reviewer comments happen, and they're especially problematic when they have this disproportionate effect on communities that are already getting messages all the time that they don't belong. And so we at Reviewer Zero are working to raise awareness of this, to provide training for reviewers so that they don't make these kinds of comments. And we also want to emphasize that if you receive this kind of comment, it's definitely not okay. And you do have the option to report it to the editor or work with your mentor to have your mentor flag it to the editor. So if you get comments on your work that are derogatory, unprofessional, racist, abusive, you don't have to take it sitting down. I got one of those comments earlier on the first paper we ever submitted from my lab. I got a review like this, and I had a discussion with both the editor who handled it and the editor-in-chief. So you don't have to be the one that flags it. You can talk to your mentor and they can flag it, but there should be consequences for reviewers who make such comments. And editors are interested in hearing from you because they don't want those people to continue reviewing for their journal. And so if you flag it, the editor could remove that person from writing reviews for the journal in the future. So remember that you do have allies, and people are receptive to being told when something like this happens so that they can prevent it from happening again. You might get editors who say, oh, I didn't see a problem with the review. And in those cases, maybe you want to reevaluate the editors in the journals that you want to interact with. Right. So we are going to next take some examples of reviewer comments that are problematic and talk together about how those comments are problematic and how you could respond to problematic reviews. So here is an example of a problematic review. So this paper is clearly written by a non-native speaker of English. It's awkward and stilted. Please have a native speaker review your manuscripts prior to submission. This kind of comment is nasty, and it's unfortunately not uncommon. So we frequently see people posting on social media indicating that they get comments like this. And at Reviewer Zero, we have members of our community who have gotten comments like this. And it's problematic because, first of all, because of the clear bias, but second, because it doesn't matter as long as the content is conveyed clearly. This is an example of a preference rather than a preference for a particular way of writing, rather than actual comments about the science and the way it's communicated. So here are a couple ways that you could respond. You could respond, the reviewer has expressed an aesthetic dispreference for the style of writing, but if the content is not clear, then you should specify particular points where clarification is needed. And then you could follow up to the editor by saying this comment is not appropriate and it serves to further marginalize second language English speakers. So this is an example of how you could push back, call out the reviewer, ask them to make a comment that's more constructive, and flag it to the editor. All right, so what we're going to do next is we're going to stop recording for a little bit of time, and if you're all, and then we'll share some resources. Yeah, so that's a good question. So doesn't the editor read the reviews? Why aren't they addressing when you get these nasty, biased, or racist comments? So I think I'll give my opinion, and I could let Matt chime in too. I think in some cases they actually don't read very carefully. And I'll say that editors are faced with a huge amount of time pressure, and they handle a lot of papers. And in some cases they might skim and miss it, like no maliciousness, they might just miss it. In another case, I think they might not realize that it's problematic. I'd like to think that if they did realize it was problematic, they would comment. Maybe this a little too optimistic, but my sense is they probably missed it or they personally didn't see the problem. But Matt, what are your senses?
I think part of it is that, if you've grown up in this system, you kind of don't realize how problematic it is. And so, for example, with the comment about this reads like it's written by a non-native speaker, I saw that in a friend of mine was an editor, and there was a review. I wrote a review, and the other review said that. And I wrote to him and I said, hey, this is not really acceptable. This was actually a very well-written paper. The content of the paper was not very good, but the writing was actually great. And this person I wrote to is not a native speaker of English. And I think it was just that it never occurred to him that people shouldn't say this. He'd heard it so many times that he began to see it as not problematic. And so it's often just the blindness that occurs in that type of situation. Here, we've got some questions in both the Google Doc and in the chat.
Yeah, so
you want me to read out anything from, okay, go ahead.
Sure, I'll do the one in the chat, and then maybe you could read the one in the Google Doc. So the one in the chat is, yeah, sometimes the methods aren't clear because journals force you to be concise. So they have specific word limits on the methods section. And so if you get a response about the methods being unclear, you could say, well, unfortunately, we have these space restrictions. Do you want to point out places where we could be more concise or specific things that you want mentioned? The other thing you could do is you can go over the word limits. Usually journals are not so picky on the revision because you can say like, well, we met your word requirements and then the reviewers asked us to put in all this additional information, so it's not our fault. And so usually we've been able to go actually quite a fair bit over the word limits for revision when the reviewers ask us for more content. And you could also consider if there's cases where you could put things in the supplement. But it's if there are hard journal limits about reference numbers or word limits, you can definitely mention those in places where you can't accommodate all the things that reviewers are asking for.
Question in the chat is, in the Google Doc, I've observed different practices regarding the response to the review deadline. So I've heard it's possible to request a one-time extension for submitting the response letter. Is this correct? And if you miss the deadline, are there any potential issues? I think that, so some journals have this, that they say, if you want to submit a revision, you have to do so, say, in 90 days or even less than that. And what it is very common to request extensions. And I can tell you, remember, the editors are pressed for time. And basically, when you send in the revision, they have to do work. So often the editor is like, great, please don't send it to me right away. I'm already pretty busy. So I wouldn't feel bad about asking that question at all. And I do think, though, if there is a deadline and you can't make it, you should tell them. And because it's really not a big deal to ask for an extension, especially if it's just for a few days. Say, look, Paige has a comment here. Yeah, I just asked for an extension. The submission, the editor is happy to extend. I've never had anyone complain about an extension request. Yeah.
Yeah, we've gotten very long extensions, like a year, maybe more. So don't feel afraid to ask. Yep. Great. So we're going to share with you our toolkit for responding to reviews. So here is just a Google Drive that we put together with resources that might help you in crafting your next rebuttal letter. And of course, we have another 10 minutes left. So we do have additional slides, but we're also happy to take questions. So keep them coming as things pop into your mind.
And I'll just say, with the toolkit, one thing that we haven't dived into too much here, there are many, many things we haven't, just because of the limited time we have together. One thing that's really important to just keep in mind with these reviews is the emotional response that comes along with them. It's not fun to get critiques, right? It never is. It's always, it's always difficult to process. And maintaining motivation, which was brought up much earlier, is a huge part of what you need to do. And so we gave some resources in there for thinking about how to manage your emotional responses, how to work with having a community, and also thinking about practices that help you sort of breathe a little, calm down, and then be in a better place to deal with the comments. And I feel like, there's many stages you go through. You get these comments and you're like, I can't believe what idiots these reviewers are. How could they say this? They're so dumb. And 3 days later, you're like, that's actually a really good point. We probably should have addressed that. And so it's good to just be aware that that's part of the process, and it's not, you shouldn't try and push those away and imagine. I think everyone feels this way. And so it's a really critical part of learning to be part of the peer review process.
One insight that I just learned this year, which I feel like I should have learned sooner, is it's not good for me to read all of the reviews in one sitting. Like, you have 3 reviewers and they each have like 20 comments. And I felt like it was just like sitting in a room and being yelled at for 30 minutes and not being allowed to say anything. And like, I would not ever do that in my real life. So why would I do that with reading reviews? And so I realized that what's better for me is to read them a little bit at a time over days or longer. And that just made it better for me to manage my emotions personally.
That's great. And that's a great suggestion. And I think it's that everyone is different. So it's good to try different things. And some things that work for one person are not going to work for you, but there's lots of different ideas you can try that are all in this toolkit. So we hope we've helped you understand this black box a little, to get inside the peer review system. And we hope we've given you some ideas about what peer review is, about what kind of comments you can expect, the good, the bad, and the ugly, and how you can respond. So you have the capability to respond to these things, and it's part of the process. I think it's something that all of you as junior scientists are ready to do. It's just something that if you use these techniques to help manage your emotional responses, stay motivated, and navigate some of the difficult parts of the process, you'll come out on the other side. And I think you'll have better science, and you'll be able to get promoted, which is what we would like all of you to have the opportunity to do. The other thing is just to remember that you're not alone. Everyone is navigating this difficult process. Make sure to talk to your mentors a lot. Talk to your fellow graduate students. Reach out through different networks that you have to help manage what is a very difficult process. We'd really like your feedback. We have a feedback survey here. We'll also send it around via email as well. But if you want to just pop open the window right now, you could go ahead and answer it when you have a chance. We also wanted to let you know that we're doing a lot of different things. And so we're working with early career authors in a couple different ways. In addition to this workshop, we have a manuscript pre-review service, which we call Formative and Interactive Review FAIR, where we're trying to help people sort of navigate the beginning stages of the peer review process. So we're piloting this right now, and we're hoping to expand it later. For people who are reviewers and editors, we have a learning communities, and we're trying to work with people who serve in those different roles. If you're interested, just drop us a line. You can send an email to admin@reviewerzero.net, and we're always happy to hear from you, any comments you might have. So thanks so much for coming today. Thanks to the NSF for helping out the work, for APA for supporting it. We have our Twitter handle here. We are also on Blue Sky, I believe at the same handle. Is that correct? Can't remember what our Blue Sky account is called. And yeah, we're happy to hang out for a couple more minutes. We have a little bit more time, and we're happy to answer any additional questions you might have. Thanks so much for coming. There's the Blue Sky.